Hello, and welcome back to Pretty Jazz Podcast. This is Serial Killers Unfiltered, Episode 4, Richard Ramirez. Stay tuned. Ricardo Leva Munoz Ramirez, also Richard Ramirez, was born in El Paso, Texas on February 29, 1960, to Julian Tapia Ramirez and Mercedes Munoz Ramirez. He was the youngest of their 5 children. His father, a Mexican national and former Ciudad policeman, later became a laborer on various railroads, including the Santa Fe Railway. Also, he was an alcoholic who was prone to fits of anger that often resulted in physical abuse towards his wife and children. Richard began smoking marijuana and drinking alcohol at just the age of 10. As a 12-year-old, Richard, or Richie as he was known to his family, was strongly influenced by his older cousin Miguel, Mike Ramirez, a decorated Green Beret combat veteran who himself had already become a serial killer and a rapist during his time in the United States Army in the Vietnam War. Mike often boasted of his brutal war crimes and shared Polaroid photos with Richard, showing Vietnamese women who he had raped, murdered, and dismembered or decapitated. Richard would later state, while incarcerated, that he was fascinated rather than repulsed by the images and stories Mike shared with him. Mike taught his young cousin some of his military skills, such as killing with stealth and effectively staying hidden in the dark, especially at night. Around this time, Richard began to seek escape from his father's violent temper by sleeping in a local cemetery. Richard was present on May 4th, 1973, when Mike fatally shot his wife Jessie in the face with a handgun during a domestic argument. Like the graphic photos and stories of his cousin's war crimes in Vietnam, Ramirez would later similarly remark that witnessing the murder was not traumatic for him in any traditional sense, but rather a subject of fascination. After the shooting, Richard became sullen and withdrawn from his family and peers. Mike was later found not guilty of Jesse's murder by reason of insanity, with the shooting attributed to post-traumatic stress disorder from his service in Vietnam. He was confined for several years at the Texas State Mental Hospital. Shortly after the shooting, Richard moved in with his older sister Ruth and her husband Roberto, an obsessive peeping Tom who took Richard along on his nocturnal exploits. After Mike was released from the mental hospital in 1977, he sometimes accompanied Richard and Roberto on these voyeuristic walks, spying on women in the nearby areas through their windows. By the time Richard had turned 14, the early 1974, he had began using LSD frequently. He and Mike resumed bonding over their shared use of drugs and alcohol. It was during this period that Richard began to cultivate an interest in Satanism and the occult. When he reached adolescence, Ramirez began to meld his burgeoning sexual fantasies with graphic violence, including forced bondage, murder, mutilation, and rape. While still in school, he took a job at a local Holiday Inn and used his master key to rob sleeping patrons. On at least one occasion, Ramirez molested 2 children in an elevator at the hotel, but he was never reported or prosecuted for this act. His employment ended abruptly after Ramirez attempted to rape a woman in her hotel room and was caught in the act by the victim's husband. Although the husband beat Ramirez at the scene, criminal charges were dropped when the couple, who lived out of state, declined to return to Texas to testify against him. Ramirez dropped out of high school in the 9th grade. In 1982, at the age of 22, he moved and settled permanently in California. It was around this time that Ramirez began to use cocaine, which quickly became his substance of choice, and began to commit theft and burglaries to procure money for his sustaining addiction. He lived nomadically between San Francisco and Los Angeles County during this time, prior to his incarceration. He frequently traveled the northern and southern areas of California, both before and during his year-long crime spree. On August 24, 1985, Ramirez traveled 76 miles of Los Angeles in a stolen orange Toyota to Mission Viejo. That night, he arrived at the home of 45-year-old James Romero Jr., who had just returned from a family vacation to Rosarito Beach in Mexico. Romero's son, 13-year-old James Romero III, happened to be awake. While his family was asleep, James went outside of his house to retrieve a pillow inside a truck, which was locked. When he was outside, he heard rustling noise. Assuming that it was an animal, James went to investigate the noise, but did not notice anything unordinary. James then went into his garage to begin working on his mini bike before hearing Ramirez's footsteps outside the house. Thinking there was a prowler, James, after observing Ramirez through his bedroom window, went to awake his parents, and Ramirez fled the scene. James raced outside and noted the color, make, and style of the car, as well as the partial license plate number. Romero contacted the police with this information, believing James had chased away a thief. After this encounter, Ramirez broke into the house of Bill Carnes, age 30, and his fiancée, Inez Erickson, age 29, through their back door. Ramirez entered the sleeping couple's bedroom and awakened Carnes when he cocked his .25 caliber gun. He shot Carnes 3 times in the head before turning his attention to Erickson. Ramirez told her that he was the Night Stalker and forced her to swear she loved Satan as he beat her with his fists and bound her with his neckties from the closet. After stealing what he could find, Ramirez dragged Erickson into another room before raping her. He then demanded cash and more jewelry and made her swear on Satan there was no more. Before leaving the home, Ramirez told Erickson, "Tell them the Night Stalker was here." Erickson untied herself and went to a neighbor's house for help. Surgeons removed 2 of the 3 bullets from Carnes' head, and he survived his injuries. Erickson gave a detailed description of the assailant to investigators, and the police obtained a cast of Ramirez's footprint from the Romero house. The stolen Toyota was found abandoned on August 28th in Koreatown, Los Angeles, and the police obtained a single fingerprint from the rear view mirror, despite Ramirez's careful efforts to wipe the car clean of his prints. The print was positively identified, belonging to Ramirez, who was described by police as a 25-year-old drifter from Texas with a long rap sheet that included many arrests for traffic and illegal drug violations. The identification of Ramirez's print was described as a near miracle, as the system used to identify him was recently installed, as well as the fact that the system contained the fingerprints of criminals born after January 1st, 1960, only a month before Ramirez was born. On August 29, 1985, law enforcement officials decided to release a mugshot of Ramirez from a 1984 arrest for the auto theft to the media. At the police press conference, it was announced, "We know who you are, and soon everyone else will. There will be no place you can hide." On August 30th, 1985, Ramirez took a bus to Tucson, Arizona to visit his brother, unaware that he had become the lead story in virtually every major newspaper and television news program across California. After failing to meet his brother due to him not being home, Ramirez returned to Los Angeles early on the morning of August 31st. He walked past police officers who were staking out the bus terminal in hopes of catching the killer should he attempt to flee on an outbound bus, and into a convenience store in East Los Angeles. After noticing a group of elderly Hispanic women fearfully identifying him as El Matador, Ramirez saw his face on one of the front page newspapers, La Opinión, with a headline calling him Invasor Nocturno, and fled the store in a panic. After running across Santa Ana Freeway, he attempted to carjack an unlocked Ford Mustang, but was pulled out by angry residents, Justino Peon and Jose Bergion. Ramirez ran across the street and attempted to take keys from Angela de la Torre. The woman's husband, Manuel de la Torre, witnessed the attempt and struck Ramirez over the head with a fence post in the pursuit. A group of over 10 residents formed and chased Ramirez down Hubbard Street in Boyle Heights. The group of citizens forced and held Ramirez down and relentlessly beat him. Around 8 a.m., police were called over a disturbance in the area with few details with indications of a fight. Police arrived quickly at the 3700 block of Hubbard and found Ramirez was severely beaten and unarmed and took him into custody. The crowd grew several hundred people and was becoming unruly toward Ramirez, and the responding officer, Andy Ramirez, stayed behind while Officer Jim Kaiser drove Ramirez to Hollenbeck Police Station. Jury selection for the trial began on July 22, 1988. At his first court appearance, Ramirez raised his hand with a pentagram drawn on it and yelled, "Hail Satan." On August 3, 1988, the Los Angeles Times reported that some jail employees overheard Ramirez planning to shoot the prosecutor with a gun, which Ramirez intended to have smuggled into the courtroom. Consequently, a metal detector was installed outside, and intensive searches were conducted on people entering. On August 14th, the trial was interrupted because one of the jurors, Phyllis Singletary, did not arrive at the courtroom. Later that day, she was found shot to death in her apartment. The jury was terrified, wondering if Ramirez had somehow directed this event from inside his prison cell, and whether or not he could reach other jurors. However, it was ultimately determined that Ramirez was not responsible for Singletary's death, and she was not shot and killed as a result of Ramirez, but by her boyfriend, who later committed suicide with the same weapon in a hotel. The alternate juror who replaced Singletary was too frightened to return to her home. On September 20th, 1989, Ramirez was convicted of all 43 charges: 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, 14 burglaries. His victims include Mei Lung, a 9-year-old, murdered by Ramirez on April 10, 1984. In the basement of his apartment building in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco, Luing was with her 8-year-old brother and looking for a lost $1 bill when Ramirez approached the girl and told her to follow him into the basement. Once they were in the basement, Ramirez beat, strangled, and raped Lewing before stabbing her to death with a switchblade, hanging her partially nude body from a pipe by her blouse. The killing was not linked to Ramirez until 2009, when his DNA was matched to a sample obtained at the crime scene. In 2016, officials disclosed evidence of a second subject identified through another DNA sample retrieved from the scene, who is believed to have been present at Lewing's murder. Authorities have not publicly identified the suspect, described as being a juvenile at the time, and did not have any charges brought due to lack of evidence. Jenny Vincow. The 79-year-old was killed by Ramirez on June 27, 1984, when he also burglarized her home in Glassell Park, Los Angeles. Dale Akazazi. On March 17, 1985, Ramirez shot and killed 34-year-old Akazazi at her home in Rosemead, California, after also attacking her housemate, Maria Hernandez, 20, who survived. Taizan Lian Veronica Vu, on the same day, March 17, 1985, was murdered in Rosemead. Vu, 30, was dragged from her car and killed. Vincent Zazara, on March 27, 1985, Ramirez broke into the home of Vincent Zazara, 64, and killed him while he slept. Maxine Zazara was also killed as a part of the same attack on her husband. William Doy was killed when Ramirez broke into his home in Monterey Park, May 14, 1985, and shot him fatally. Mabel Ma Bell, the 84-year-old, died after Ramirez attacked her in her Monrovia, California home on June 29, 1985. Mary Louise Cannon, 77-year-old widow, was killed in her Arcadia, California home on July 2, 1985. Joyce Lucille Nelson was 61 years old when she was beaten to death by Ramirez when he burglarized her Monterey Park home, July 7, 1985. Max Needing, a 68-year-old male, attacked with a machete, shot, and killed by Ramirez on July 20th, 1985. Lena Needing, the wife of Max Needing, was also killed the same day when he robbed their home. Shania Rong Kivanoff, excuse the pronunciation, the 32-year-old was shot and killed while asleep in his home in Sun Valley on July 20th, 1985. Elias Abawat was shot and killed in his Diamond Bar family home when Ramirez came to burglarize it on August 8th, 1985. By the time of the trial, Ramirez had fans who were writing him letters and paying him visits. During the penalty phase of the trial on November 7th, 1989, he was sentenced to death in California's gas chamber. He stated to reporters after the death sentences, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland." The trial cost $1.8 million, which at the time made the most expensive murder trial in California's history until surpassed by O.J. Simpson murder case in 1994. Beginning in 1985, Doreen Leoy wrote him nearly 75 letters during his incarceration. In 1988, Ramirez proposed to Doreen, and on October 3rd, 1996, they were married in California's San Quentin State Prison. For many years before Ramirez's death, Doreen stated that she would commit suicide when Ramirez was executed. However, Doreen eventually broke ties with Ramirez in 2009 after DNA confirmed that he had raped and murdered Maylene. By the time of his death in 2013, Ramirez was engaged to a 23-year-old writer. On August 7, 2006, Ramirez's first round of state appeals ended unsuccessfully when the California Supreme Court upheld his convictions and death sentence. On September 7, 2006, the California Supreme Court denied his request for a rehearing. Ramirez had additional appeals pending until the time of his death. Ramirez died of complications secondary to B-cell lymphoma at Marion General Hospital in Green Bay, California on June 7, 2013. He had also been infected by chronic substance abuse and chronic hepatitis C viral infection. Thank you so much for listening to Serial Killers Unfiltered with Pretty Jazz. Have a wonderful evening. Bye.